In this video, we are going to be covering the hot new stamina action game everyone is talking about. That's right, it's Grime. Grime is a 2D, side-scrolling, 3D, Souls-like stamina action Metroidvania. Just pick whichever combination of those words you like the most. I'm too tired to figure this shit out anymore. I just spent the last 2 weeks listening to everyone who ever worked a fucking janitor job at Ubisoft pretend like they know how to make video games. Honestly, at first, I was pretty sure I hated this game, but it grew on me a lot over the time it took for me to beat it, and despite its somewhat annoying flaws, I think it's probably worth a couple of playthroughs if this is the type of game you like playing. Not very many games let you play as a guy with a black hole for a head and armor made out of nerve tissue and teeth. I think that kind of creativity is worth something. As usual, we can get the core mechanics out of the way first. The combat in Grime should look pretty familiar now after over a decade of this type of game. You press the button to make the weapon go. Some weapons go slow, some weapons go fast, and some weapons groan with mindless pain they can't understand. Attacks cost stamina, weapons scale off of your stat block. You get how this works by now. Grime does attempt to innovate on this formula a little bit through its stronger emphasis on parrying and its high rewards for killing enemies via your parry, which is actually an attack of its own that will let you absorb enemies under certain circumstances. Weaker enemies like these ones have a red health bar, which means that if you parry their attacks, they will be absorbed into your mass. If you absorb enough of them, or just one of them if it's a stronger enemy or a mini-boss, you will unlock the ability to unlock a passive skill associated with them. These skills are unlocked with hunt points, which you get from killing certain bosses and mini-bosses. Obviously, because of this, you want to be absorbing as many enemy types as possible to unlock as many of these passive skills as possible, which incentivizes you to kill more with counterattacks than just by smashing shit with your big axe made out of fingernails. And some of these passives will also let you lean into certain playstyles. For example, I tried to take passives like this one that gave me stamina on Absorb and this one that gave me a damage buff on Absorb to try to get the most out of parrying most attacks. There are some other things here like upgrading your dodge dash and upgrading your pull ability, but a lot of these passives are also just sort of generic stat boosts like this one. Combined with the rest of the game's character build options like weapon choice and your stat choices though, it all works together to create some slight differences in build, probably enough to justify playing through the game at least a couple of times if you really enjoy it. Later on, you will start to find enemies with wild-ass looking health bars like this. The gray health can't be absorbed, and if you try to absorb an attack, it will just be deflected instead. You need to hit them with normal attacks to weaken them, and then when you get to a segment of red health, you can absorb it normally. Health bars are divided up into all sorts of different configurations. It isn't just a matter of weakening the Pokemon enough to hit it with a Pokeball. This works pretty well to create combat that is a little bit more creative and cerebral than most of these types of games usually are. Grime in general being a more creative than average game is going to be a theme that we see a lot of going forward. As is the case with all great games, bosses follow all of the same rules as normal enemies. You can parry most attacks, and they have segmented health bars. Any attack that can't be parried is also very obviously highlighted in red, which is something that I very much appreciate. Trying to trial and error which attacks can be parried and which can't in a game like Dark Souls was always annoying and kind of shut out an entire potential playstyle. Although if you watch a Gwen speedrun, you can kind of understand why From did it. Parry playstyles are very hard to balance unless the entire game is based around them like Sekiro. Or, maybe more relevantly, the game this video is actually about. Bosses themselves are also very well designed in terms of their animations and movements. They have multiple phases that are all very different from each other. Attack patterns are satisfying. There are some awesome creative boss mechanics like this one where you have to pull a rock out of the ground to block the vulture's breath attack. Very, very well made bosses all around. There wasn't a single boss that I found that I didn't have some kind of fun with. I'm sure I missed a couple of optional fights that are hidden around the world, but I would still stand by Grime's excellent boss design. As is usually the case for these types of indie games, the art team is putting in incredible work. Grime is made up of beautifully detailed, surreal landscapes like this one, where you're moving through an enormous mass of nerve tissue, or teeth, or flowers, but the flowers also have teeth. Just a lot of teeth all around. And none of this is just interesting design choice. It all loops back into the game's plot, which I'll cover more of soon in the spoiler section. Despite its high-quality art and game design, Grime does have some gameplay-related flaws that are pretty important to know about going into it. In order for a Metroidvania, or whatever this type of game is, to work, there is one absolutely pivotal feature it needs to have, especially if it's a comparatively difficult game like Grime, with a low number of checkpoints and tough combat. And that is a very strong, responsive, and fun movement system. Grime kind of misses the mark here. Yes, you do eventually unlock an air dash that helps, but the double jump and the grappling ability come comparatively late in the game. This means that for what feels like the overwhelming majority of the game, your movement options are very limited. Grime even includes fall damage, which honestly is kind of fucking insane for a game like this. Although I do understand why developers do it, because it makes the level design a lot easier to deal with. I would imagine basing the entire game around what if the player jumps off this would be completely exhausting from the standpoint of pacing and how the game is sequenced out. Coupled with the rough around the edges movement, this game's checkpoints and fast travel points are pretty rare. I can assure you there will be a lot of times where you progress pretty far, die, and then need to retrace your steps pretty deep into a map because you haven't found a checkpoint yet. This, in and of itself, isn't that bad, but if you're going to maintain this sort of old school style of difficulty, then you need to make sure that your movement system is engaging enough to make running back to where you died feel fluid, which I don't think Grime pulls off well, at least not for about the first half of the game. Of course, like basically all stamina action games, the early game tends to be the hardest part, which compounds this problem even more. The early game in Grime is very frustrating, and I think that's probably why I had such a hard time getting into it. But later on, after I struggled through the game's start, I was glad that I did. You should also go into Grime knowing that it's a fairly short game. A playthrough is probably going to take you about 15 hours, but the game is definitely a complete, coherent package with a clear and logical ending. This isn't going to be one of those indie games where you can tell that it was only 70% finished. Grime is a fully realized, complete experience. And finally, I'm going to get into the game's storyline and world building a little bit here, so if you want to avoid spoilers, skip to here, which is pretty much just the end of the video, so I guess the game is good. Turn off the video if you don't want spoilers. Like I'm sure you probably could have guessed by the fact that this game is very heavily relying on the FromSoft model, the story is mostly told through the environment, vague statements from NPCs, and things like item descriptions. But I think Grime is genuinely special in how weird and surreal its world building is. You'll notice that your character has a black hole for a head. This isn't just an indie art style. Your character is literally a sentient black hole. As you move through the world, you will start to very quickly piece together the obvious plot point that the world you are moving around on is some sort of massive living thing. The nerve root is an area full of living, enormous nerve tissue with synaptic discharges. And yes, I know basic neuroscience. I have half of a biology degree. The primary characters you deal with the most are these rock people, who are living rocks born inside the earth that need to be mined out of the ground. They all have some sort of vague existential dread about being malformed, which causes them to devote themselves to a strange, cult-like idea that they need to be carved into perfection and then eventually polished completely. Of course, this is revealed to be meaningless later. Turns out being hotter doesn't actually make you happier. Sorry, Instagram models. This existential dread is the core concept of the game. The living rocks are all fucked up and feel like they shouldn't exist, which leads them to start a suicide cult, and also leaves them susceptible to being tricked by the weird flesh gods that we can assume that grow from the world's flesh core into becoming bodies for some sort of parasitic host. I think. I don't really know what's going on here. And these weird gods are also pointlessly obsessed with maintaining their clearly decaying world. The game's final reveal is that the player is literally a black hole that formed inside the body of a god, and all of the living things here are weird, imperfect life forms animated by the remains of the god's life force. They are just flying through space on a giant, nondescript body doomed to eventually die. Kind of like us. The vague feeling of existential dread that these rock guys feel is a distant memory of being part of a perfect god, which they can't reconcile with their weird, rocky bodies. In the context of the storytelling of Grime, human beings are ugly little rock men filled with irreconcilable dread that we attempt to get out by finger painting and shit. In the final area, the player character finds a bunch of memories of the gods' last moments alive, showing that even they are struggling with their own mortality. This struck a particular chord with me for a lot of reasons. First and foremost, from a religious and spiritual perspective, I'm a Gnostic, which means that if you do a little bit of oversimplifying, depending on your interpretation, I really do believe that we are the product of a dead god shattered into a bunch of tiny little pieces. I really do believe that we are material beings given some sort of divine consciousness, living a somewhat strange existence where we paradoxically feel born to die. Humans love to obsess over vanity, and we definitely love to hang on to material concepts long after they have rotted out and become useless. I think we are living in a very particular time in human history where these sorts of existential questions and concepts are going to become more and more common in our art and stories. In ancient times, the forests and the oceans were places of mystery. Now we've pretty much mapped out the entire globe. Then we mapped out the sky, and soon, with the invention of technologies like the James Webb Space Telescope, we will literally map space and time itself. And worst of all, according to the science, as of this video in 2022, the universe seems to have a measurable lifespan. How are we going to deal with the increasing reality that we are living in a vast, infinitely large universe that, despite its incomprehensible size and age, is also just as mortal as we are? How are we going to decide what the point of it all was? Will we turn to more optimistic theories like Nobel Prize laureate Sir Roger Penrose's idea that the universe is an infinite cycle of universes dying and then being reborn? Will we turn to sciences of consciousness and neurology that put forward ideas like fundamental consciousness? Will we turn to more esoteric spiritual ideas like Gnosticism? Will we just go fucking insane and hold on to our material reality even though we know it's a scam? I don't know how we're going to decide how to deal with it, but I do know there are going to be a lot of people expressing their struggle with this existential dread by making games like Grime. And I think we can probably take a little bit of comfort knowing that if art like this is being made, that means everyone is going through the same thing, and we aren't alone. In the end, I think Grime is a good game, and a great piece of art. If you like challenging stamina action style platforms like Hollow Knight or maybe Blasphemous, I think you'll most likely enjoy Grime. And thanks to my friends at GOG, you can actually pick it up on sale if you use my link down in the comments. If you want to see more videos like this one, consider subscribing. Likes and comments are also very helpful. And if you want more ways to support the channel, you should check out my Patreon, where for as little as $2 a month, you can get some exclusive podcast content. My podcast, Inherently Optimistic, is available pretty much everywhere podcasts are. You can also find a link in the description to my Twitch channel, where I stream from time to time, and my active Discord community. And finally, you should follow me on Twitter so you don't miss any important updates. Even if you're subscribed and you have notifications turned on, you likely won't see my uploads. So make sure you're following me everywhere for announcements. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.